We have a panel discussion is going to be on the pandemic again, how it will shape future cities and high rises, but hopefully a different slant to what we talked about before. We have Glen Pederick, who is the building services leader at Victoria at Arcadis, will be asking our questions. We also have Julian Anderson, who is the director at BATESSMART, and we have Natalie Burdon, who is the senior manager for development at the GPT group. I can see everyone's videos is on, which is excellent. Just a very quick little intro. Natalie has over 20 years experience in the property and construction industry across multiple sectors, including office, residential, hotels and healthcare. She has particular current interest in how customers and tenants interact with and use commercial and retail spaces. Julian is director at BATESSMART and has extensive experience in leading large architectural and consultant teams. He has worked on a number of significant major projects in Australia and overseas. Some of these you will know, 435 Burke, 60 Collins, 32 Flinders Street, and hospitality projects such as the Hilton Melbourne, Chadstone Hotel and Adina at Southbank, and some work with Merv. Glen is a chartered mechanical engineer with over 30 years experience in the design of HVAC and vertical transportation systems and designed many major buildings around Australia. He's passionate about learning lessons from the pandemic. So let's dive in deep and find out what some of those lessons and challenges have been. Would you welcome our panel? And Glen, I'm going to hand it over to you. Thank you for taking over the reins. Cheers.
Pleasure. Thanks, Timothy. Look, with the COVID pandemic has caused global disruption on an unprecedented scale. Even in Australia, where our COVID management has been so successful, the impact on all our lives and on the Australian economy has been devastating. You're 20 times more likely to contract COVID if you're located inside when compared to being outside. So this is really a disease whose spread is associated and linked with buildings. So what will our industry look like post-pandemic? What is the new normal going to be? Even if we're all vaccinated, the vaccines only last for 6 months. What about if there's another strain or a whole new pandemic? So it's important that post-pandemic, we don't just go back to the old normal, go back to business as usual and think everything's going to be okay and it won't happen again. I think it's important that we need to learn some lessons from this pandemic and used our shared experiences and our professional expertises to think about what we can do to improve the building stock and to make our future buildings more resistant to viral spread. The first topic we want to start talking about today is my pet topic. It's pandemic resilience in air conditioning and ventilation systems. Going back to fundamentals, the three ways that you can contract COVID from another person are by direct contact with an infected person, by shaking hands or kissing or touching. The second way is by aerosol transmission from an infectious person, which is breathing in the air from an infected person. And the third way is from surface, touching aerosol droplets from an infected surface. What I want to talk about today is considering the airflow in air conditioning systems, which is really the second method, which is the aerosol transmission of the virus. The first documented case of aerosol transmission of COVID via an air conditioning system happened in Guangzhou, China, back in January 2020. It seems like a long time ago now. But one person who had been in Wuhan, if you can remember back then, was at a Chinese restaurant in Guangzhou and managed to infect 9 other people at that while they had dinner. Interestingly, 6 of those people were at other tables and didn't directly contact with that person, but they were in the airflow path of the air conditioning system, and that's how they managed to become infected. So this airflow part of infection of COVID's been around for a while, and we've sort of known about it. And I guess it's only recently becoming more and more of a hot topic. So we'll go back to the basics of sort of how air conditioning works. So with traditional overhead ducted systems, the supply air ceiling diffusers operate using what we call the Coanda effect. So the air, as it comes out of a supply air register, attaches itself to the ceiling, and as it moves along the ceiling, it entrains the airstream from around it to create a mixing effect. That mixing effect, and we do that as engineers because the mixing effect avoids people feeling cold drafts. But one of the consequences of that is that we kind of mix the fresh supply air with the room air, and we kind of mix up all the contaminants that are in the room at the same time. Once we get to that, the conditioned air is circulated around a building using an air handling unit. That air handling unit cools the supply air and ducts it to condition the space, and then mixes it with the supply air diffusers. So most of that mixed room air goes back to an air handling unit to reduce energy consumption, gets filtered and returned back to the room. So you get this cycle of an air handling system which mixes up the room air, then takes it back to an air handling system and recirculates and pumps it back into the room. So you can see if somebody in that room has some sort of a infection like a COVID, how easily it can spread around a building. So for buildings with traditional air handling systems, there are some strategies that we can think about to reduce that contaminant spread. One of the strategies is to minimise the extent of the recirculation. And a straightforward way of doing that is to increase the amount of outside air at the air handling unit, which effectively dilutes that recirculated air. If possible, go back to 100% fresh air without any recirculation. And another important strategy is to remove and modify systems which are in the space that basically directly recirculate. Systems like fan-assisted VAV boxes or supplementary fan coil units are not so good in this new environment. Another strategy can be to upgrade the filters in the air handling unit to higher quality filters. There are the very highest level of filters before you get to hospital grade at about Merv 15 are actually capable of capturing these particles. And it can often just be a simple retrofit solution in an air handling unit. Ultraviolet light in air handling systems can be used to purify the air. And the ultraviolet light kills viruses and organisms by destroying their DNA, so it can be very effective. Another system which is just starting to get more popularity is called a bipolar ionization system. And bipolar ionization systems sit within the supply air ductwork and create an electrical charge on the air particles as they pass through the system. And these charged particles apparently actively seek out virus particles and kill them, which becomes like an active system for killing any bacteria or virus in the space. They've traditionally been used for things like air cleaning and odor removal, but COVID is kind of another application for that product. Another strategy, is humidity control. The optimum relative humidity for people is about 40 to 60%. In that sort of mid-level, that's when our body is at its strongest. When we get to the really low relative humidities, we become more susceptible to infections. And in Melbourne in winter, we do get really low relative humidity. So adding humidity humidification effectively can be a way of helping to build our immunity up to infection. The other solutions outside of the retrofits are just putting in different types of systems. Underfloor air conditioning systems use a raised floor plenum to supply the air up through the floor. And the people who have used these systems are very good for a very high indoor air quality. The air from the floor effectively comes up and displaces the room air so that you feel like you're in a cleaner environment. So rather than mixing, they tend to displace the old air. So they have a better air quality and less tendency to transport contaminants around the space. The other systems which are becoming more considered is natural ventilation, and of course the main advantage of natural ventilation is that there's no recirculation. You open the window and fresh air comes in. There are sort of three arrangements we can use with those. There's sort of a single-sided ventilation, which is probably a bit more like at home. And there's cross-flow ventilation and stack ventilation. And as engineers, we can model each of those, determine how effective they are. But I guess the golden rule with natural ventilation is that the more airflow you get, the better the dilution of any contaminants in the space. So look, that's just a bit of a brief intro on some of the things that are available to us as engineers. I might throw to any quick questions. Maybe I should let the rest of the panel have a bit of a chance to talk about this one. Sorry, guys, I got to be carried away.
Thanks, Glen. Natalie, are you okay if I ask Glen a question?
Yeah, go ahead.
I was wondering, natural vent, how practical is that to retrofit, or operable windows, how practical is that to retrofit to a commercial building as part of a base building refurbishment, Glen? Because I've got clients who are saying to us, I want to retrofit operable windows and have fresh air coming into my building in a commercial setting.
Yeah, it can be awkward in a lot of spaces because there's the potential for the paper flying off the desk, and someone wants the window open and somebody wants the window closed. So it becomes a bit hard to know when we're working in our own little office, like we have been at home for the last year. It's a bit easier to open the window if you're uncomfortable, but it's harder in a bigger shared space. I guess whether you can practically do that retrofitted depends on the facade system itself and how easily it can be retrofitted. But traditionally, there's been that dispute about trying to make everybody happy, which is the bane of every mechanical engineer's life who designs air conditioning. There's always somebody who's not happy. Yeah, but certainly once you get to the hotels, it's certainly a good solution because I guess there's been a lot of talk about the quarantine hotels and the lack of dilution and the lack of air movement. And certainly, I mean, in those situations, it really is a good solution to be able to have an open window to get fresh air in.
Yeah.
I think, Glen, there's been a lot of discussion within the office sector around, the Merv filters and the ultraviolet methods of sort of decontaminating the air. And you said before that is just below hospital grade. How do they, how does that differ? Because a lot of people think you add the Merv filters, you are at hospital grade. How does that differ to a hospital grade sort of filtration system?
Or hospital grade goes a higher level. Once you get into these Merv, even though you're capturing the really small particles, you're only capturing a certain percentage of them. And the Merv grade, you're capturing 60 or 70% of those really small particles. At hospital grade, you're capturing 99.9% of those really small particles. So it's just about the effectiveness of the filter. Yeah. But the downside with the hospital grade filters is not just the cost, but the system static pressure, which increases the cost to run the fan and has so the Merv filters are still a practical retrofit for a commercial building.
Yeah, without doing using a lot more power and therefore affecting the sustainability credentials of the building.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And one of the questions I've had to ask is how do you change the filters? And I don't even want to think about what the OH&S issues associated with that. I guess it's something for that's really something to think about, isn't it, Natalie?
It is. Yes. Really suited up, I'd say. Yeah, that's something certainly everyone would be looking into if they're looking into introducing these systems in their buildings, for sure. And have you had any experience in the hotels? There's been a lot of discussion in the media lately, about air getting between hotel rooms in the quarantine hotels, and I'm sure everyone would be interested in your thoughts on how that works.
Yeah, look, it seems that the biggest reason, from my understanding with these, is it's just these older hotels with really poor ventilation. And I guess when I was reading the reports and studying it, if you've been one of those hotels where you have a shower. Yeah, if say an older hotel and you have a shower and the mist never gets off the shower screen and the mirror's still fogged up, that's sort of a lack of airflow through the. Most of the exhaust air from the hotel room is out of the bathroom areas, and if those systems are doing really low rates, then you kind of in a sealed hotel room, effectively you're getting really stagnant air. And eventually it migrates its way somewhere through the building. And a lot of these old hotels have very poor ventilation in the corridor areas as well. So eventually the air just migrates its way through the building in an uncontrolled fashion because it's really stagnant. And I think that's kind of what they've been experiencing. So that's it's really interesting because a lot of the airflow paths and stuff I've read about aren't what you'd ever predict to happen, but it's what they're experiencing. And really, probably some of these systems were, really good years ago when they commissioned them and installed them, but over time they've just, become clogged up and they're not working the way they were. So yeah, there's a lot of work to do to get quarantine hotels working correctly, whether it be putting people somewhere else or doing a lot of work on the ventilation systems to bring them up to scratch. Yeah.
I guess when the hotels were designed, they weren't necessarily designed with the specific requirements in mind, and that's where, the focus needs to be going forward.
Yeah, well, like I say, we're all learning a lot, aren't we? I guess in this pandemic, yeah, and like I say, we just need to do it better from now on, I guess, and learn from this.
Absolutely.
It might be a good time to throw to Julian for his discussion on building resilience in the built environment. I'm just mindful we don't run out of time, Julian.
Yeah, sure.
You have a bit of a shot. Yeah.
Let's get into it. I mean, I sort of started to contemplate this question from the perspective of what do our cities need to look like into the future in order to be more resilient? Because I think what happened during I know what happened during the pandemic in Melbourne and other cities in Australia is that people didn't necessarily have a need to come into our city. So we so one of the things we looked at was or developed an understanding, the land use of the 19 land uses in Melbourne, residential and commercial land uses are the numbers 1 and 2, and then the third highest land use is actually car parking in Melbourne, and car parking occupies 460 hectares of land within central Melbourne, which equates to 1.5 times the area of Central Park in New York. So we were conscious of that, and we were also conscious of the project that started in Melbourne. And actually, it's talked about in today's paper, Postcode 3000, which was about addressing the lack of people that were living in the city. In 1988, there were only 3,000 people living in central Melbourne. So we said, well, we think what we're lacking in central Melbourne is a diversity of use. And the other thing we've started to explore is developed an understanding of the fact that space for community use in central Melbourne ranks last on the list of land uses and actually occupies less than 0.5% of land use. So we said, well, what if we could develop a mechanism that focused on multi-level car parks in central Melbourne, of which there are about 20 sort of decently sized, good sized car parks. And so we developed this proposition which contemplated an idea that if you could study these car parks and establish the potential development area of these car park sites and then actually sell that developable area to other developers in central Melbourne. So you could say, you could establish the developable area of a car park site in the western edge of Melbourne. And a lot of these car parks are located in the western edge of Melbourne. Work out what the developable area is and then sell that in a kind of floor area exchange process to other developers so that they can exceed the mandated plot ratio on the sites in Melbourne, which sits at 18:1. They could exceed that and deliver more yield on their sites. And then the car park would get handed back to the City of Melbourne or the state for use as vertical public open space, artist studios, affordable housing, co-working, end-of-trip facilities, a range of scenarios that would then contribute to delivery of community space, but then also open space, which we know is also lacking in Melbourne. So we looked at 3 sites in central Melbourne. We looked at a car park site on Hardware Lane on Burke Street, which is very close to the Burke Street Mall, and we said, what if that car park was refurbished and had a rooftop bar and then also some public space at ground level? So I think the other key philosophy was that we were, rather than demolishing these car parks, we were refurbishing using a kit of parts that would mean that, you know, it's a much more sustainable approach to the retention of these projects. And a portion of the sale proceeds could be held by the city or the state for the refurbishment of these projects. So then we also looked at a car park site on Little Burke Street in Chinatown, which we said could be refurbished at ground level as a market to tie into the food and beverage focus that exists in that part of Melbourne, and then also create a vertical garden in that part of Melbourne. And that car park would link Little Burke Street with Lonsdale Street, so it would also become a through-site link. And then we looked at a larger car park down towards the western end of Little Burke Street and said, this car park's located quite proximate to the sporting facilities at Marvel Stadium, so maybe there's an opportunity to refurbish this car park as a vertical active recreation facility. We could introduce basketball courts, yoga facilities, and then other sort of recreation-focused activities in order to complement the facility that exists down at that part of Melbourne. So part of the work we did on this topic also came out of a survey that we took of our clients. We used our database and generated a survey, and we said to our client group, what are the things that you would most like to see in the city when you come back in? And the number one answer was a greener, more verdant city. Number 2 was prioritising pedestrian spaces over car parking and car usage. So that really drove us to this notion that actually we need to think about creating a greener, happier, more people-focused city, and we thought this was one way of doing it. And it's obviously a topic for a lot of discussion. You know, we're seeing articles in the paper every other day about how we might start to think about reinvigorating our city and creating a more resilient city for, you know, the next recession, the next pandemic, the next event that puts pressure on our built environment. So that was so I thought I don't know if you've got any questions, Glen or Natalie, around that, but it's been that's been an interesting exercise for us, and it's started to turn our attention to diversity of land use in the centre of Melbourne, and it's a piece of work that we've done and had published quite extensively. We've engaged with Department of Planning and City of Melbourne about their assets. We know that the City of Melbourne, for example, are very keen to deliver affordable housing on their assets in the city. So there's an opportunity for conversion potentially of these car park spaces to affordable housing as well.
Yeah. We certainly do need to get people back in the city, don't we, Julian? I mean, it was a ghost town for a while there.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think from a sort of demographic perspective as well, you know, I have young children, and you know, you were able to avoid the city because there wasn't there wasn't necessarily the need to, you know, there wasn't the option to bring the kids into the city to enjoy something that existed in the city that wasn't necessarily a transactional based exercise, whether that was, you know, buying coffee, buying lunch, going to something where there's some sort of exchange of of money. You know, there needs to be, and look, it's a comment that comes up quite a lot about Melbourne is the lack of green space. You know, we have Flagstaff Gardens, there's a large, you know, and then there are pockets of space like the plaza space at 360 Collins Street. But, you know, I'm not proposing that we'll ever have Central Park in New York, but I think we need to address that balance and you know, relatively urgently, because one of the reasons I talked about postcode 3000 was that the work that Rob Adams and the City of Melbourne, the Department of Planning, did back in the early 90s was a project that took, you know, it took 10, 15, 20 years to deliver on that project, and that was focused on the closure of Swanston Street, the activation of our laneway culture, and it's been a tremendous success, and it contributed to Melbourne, you know, consistently ranking at the top of the world's most livable cities. And you kind of go, well, this is the next major event that means that we need to reconsider how we use and develop our cities. And what we're talking about now is a range of steps and measures that we need to undertake, but they're long-term projects. They take a lot of time, and if we don't, you know, we need to start them now in order to have, you know, some of these ideas or aspirations delivered 10, 15, 20 years from now, because we know, you know, we're in the you know, design construction industry. These projects take a long time to deliver.
Absolutely. I think the diversity of spaces that you talk about, Julian, for, you know, not only the people that live in the city, of which, as we know, those numbers are growing and have been growing, you know, hugely over the last number of years, but, you know, to draw those that don't live in the city in for a reason, you know, for a community-based reason even, is something that we certainly desperately need, I think.
Yeah, and certainly more green spaces for people's health and welfare is a really great thing. Yeah, I'm thinking we might have to give Natalie her chance to have something to say. We haven't got very long left. Right. So Natalie was going to talk about the commercial property sector post-COVID, or how do we get people to get back to the offices? That's probably your topic. Is that right, Natalie?
The big question, isn't it? I think. Thanks, Glen. And I think, look, as we know, following what was 2020, we're starting to see a positive return to our cities now. And as we know, the pandemic has affected different states in different ways. And it's interesting to see how the return to our cities and our offices has played out across the major capitals in our country. Certainly Sydney and Brisbane, for example, had relatively early and consistent growing return to the office following their lockdowns, which was somewhat, and of course, much shorter than that we experienced here in Melbourne. And I think for Melbourne, you know, being Glen, Julian and I are all based in Melbourne, and I think after the false start we had here in February, you know, following that, everyone's picked themselves back up, and we've continued to see Melbourne's CBD, you know, come back to life and continue to grow as more workers head back into the offices. And but what we've also seen as part of this, being, you know, working in the office and commercial sectors, is that we've also seen there's a shift in tenant ideologies around what is important to them in their offices, and their future expectations of their spaces going forward, and what it is that's going to actually really drive their employees to come back. You know, it's become apparent that organisations, or it's certainly become apparent to me, that, you know, organisations who are thinking forward to over the next few years of how they're going to use their offices, they're grappling with how to provide their employees with offices in locations and provide environments that are going to offer strong social infrastructure and the opportunity for connection with their colleagues. And I think that belonging, you know, the relationship with communities is going to reign supreme in terms of what people want out of their offices. And people are seeking to return to offices particularly, which will help enliven our city, you know, for interaction, connection with their their work community and the city community, and to accelerate learning and problem solving capabilities through that face-to-face collaboration that we all enjoy when we're together. I think what we're seeing is, as tenant needs are changing, the priority list of what a tenant or a customer may have defined and being sought after in their office space, is being sought with more conviction than ever before. And I know there's been a lot of research and a lot of surveys going around over the last 12 months as to, what people need, how much people want to work from home and work from the office. But certainly the feedback that that we're seeing, tenants and their employees, particularly millennials and Gen Y members of teams, they've actually driven some of the greatest shifts in the way that we work more recently, and they want offices that are more than just a place to work. Offices need to offer lifestyle amenity, first-class end-of-trip facilities, hotel-style concierge services, flexible working spaces, and be located in prime precincts with access to retail and dining. And I think third space offerings are another thing which, we're going to see more of in the city and in our office buildings, where landlords will be providing meeting rooms and lounge facilities as a communal facility, so that tenants don't necessarily need to take clients and customers up to their floor, to their tenanted space. And this will sort of do two things. One, it will sort of enable people to only have who they want to have into their space at any one time and know who has been there. But secondly, it will enable them to utilise the space that they do have as part of their office to focus it on their employees and the way of working, rather than necessarily cluttering up with meeting rooms that may flex in capacity and size depending on what happens, going forward. And I think tenancy spaces themselves will be designed, of course, to foster collaboration and integration of teams, and that'll be key for attracting and retaining talent and workforces, and attracting and retaining people coming back into the office day in, day out. I think people do come into the office to engage with people or to get away from them, depending on what's going on at home. And with greater expectations around flexibility for where and how we work, we're entering an era, I think, of hybrid working, and many of the workplaces as we know it, pre-pandemic, are not really necessarily equipped to support this. So I think, there's really, and Julian will have seen, has probably got something to add on this subject as well from an architectural standpoint, but certainly from a tenant engagement and customer experience point of view, that's certainly the message is loud and clear, that workplaces need to diversify and change going forward, and the drivers for being there have really shifted in a big way. So we think, giving employees and tenants and everyone that comes into the city what they need to encourage them back is a positive step, and we're certainly working towards that in our new developments, current developments, and our existing portfolio here at GPT.
Yeah, I think, Natalie, I agree with that. I mean, I think there certainly seems to be an expectation that the base, which is something you've said, that the base building will deliver more to tenants, and that tenants will, probably want to be delivering less of the, meeting room space, collaboration space. Probably, they'll want to be delivering less of that as part of their tenancy, and they'll have a desire for the base building to deliver more of that. I think I'm in 1 Nicholson Street, the Orica building. We've got a hub co-working space at the top of this building, and I do know that there's something alluring about, for our staff, actually getting out of the office, not necessarily leaving the building, but being able to go up to hub on the top floor and have a coffee. I think there's some sort of psychological benefits in getting out of the workspace. So I don't think, I think the base building operators will be able to leverage off that really successfully.
I think as well, one other point, you know, in terms of bringing people back, everyone wants to be sure they're going to be safe when they do come back to their office. And just touching on what Glen was talking about before, mechanical systems and the touchless journey throughout office spaces, be that lifting or doors or bathrooms, you know, and how lifts operate throughout these buildings is also something that's, you know, a really important factor for everybody moving forward.
Yeah, are they asking about all the things? Are the people demanding the sort of things we spoke about earlier with the ultraviolet filtration, and are they becoming more prevalent in your discussions, Natalie?
I think they certainly are. I don't think people are demanding that just yet, because I don't think the wider community is sort of that necessarily up to speed. But when it's offered, it's certainly understood, and it's certainly something, you know, GPT are doing in our portfolio. But what people are asking for is, you know, do I have to touch the lift button to get in the lift? You know, how is that going to be controlled? What is that? You know, are there touchless taps? That kind of the touchless journey is a big point of conversation and a big point of focus. Certainly, we're hearing a lot about that, and the expectations there have changed overnight.
Yeah.
Glen, I think we've just about run out of time. We're going to have to take a break. I wish we had more time for each of you today, but a wonderful, and we've covered a lot of ground in that conversation. Please, would everyone thank our three panelists here? We have Glen Pederick from Arcadis, GPT Group's Natalie Burdon, and from BATESSMART, Julian Anderson. Thank you very much, guys. And